Sarah Martinez stood on her front porch and looked out at her 5 acres of land. The morning sun was just coming up over the hills. She held her coffee cup in both hands and smiled. This was exactly what she had dreamed of for so many years. 2 years ago, Sarah had been living in a tiny apartment in the city. She worked long hours at an engineering firm downtown. Every day she sat in traffic for an hour each way. Her neighbors were loud. The air was dirty. She barely had enough money to pay rent each month. But Sarah had a plan. She saved every penny she could. She ate cheap meals and never bought new clothes. She worked extra hours whenever possible. All of her friends thought she was crazy when she told them what she wanted to do. "You want to buy a ranch?" her friend Lisa had said. "But you don't know anything about farming or animals." Sarah had laughed. "I don't want to be a big farmer. I just want some space, some quiet, a place where I can breathe." It took Sarah 3 years to save enough money. She looked at dozens of properties online. Most were too expensive. Others were too far from town. Then she found the perfect place. The property was at the end of Cedar Creek Road. It was 5 acres of mostly flat land with a small hill in the back. There was an old farmhouse that needed some work. But the price was right, and Sarah could see the potential. The day she signed the papers was the happiest day of her life. She drove out to the property and walked every inch of it. There were old oak trees along the front fence. A small creek ran through the back corner. The house needed paint and some repairs, but it was solid. Sarah spent the first 6 months fixing up the house. She painted every room. She replaced the old kitchen cabinets. She fixed the leaky roof and updated the electrical system. It was hard work, but she loved every minute of it. The mailbox was one of the first things she installed. She wanted it to match the rural feel of the property. Sarah bought thick wooden posts and built a simple wooden box. She painted it white, with black letters that spelled out Martinez Ranch. It looked perfect at the end of her long gravel driveway. After the house was ready, Sarah started on the land. She planted a vegetable garden near the kitchen window. She could grow her own tomatoes, peppers, and beans. The soil was rich and dark. Everything grew well. Then Sarah decided to get some chickens. She had never owned chickens before, but how hard could it be? She built a small coop behind the house and bought 6 hens from a local farmer. The chickens were friendly and laid fresh eggs every day. Sarah's daily routine was simple and peaceful. She woke up early and fed the chickens. Then she worked in her garden before the day got too hot. In the afternoons, she did any repairs or improvements around the property. Evenings were for sitting on the porch and watching the sunset. The neighbors were few and far between, which was exactly what Sarah wanted. The closest house was a quarter-mile away. An old man named Frank lived there with his wife. They were quiet and friendly. They waved when they drove by, but never bothered her. Sarah's work situation had improved too. She found a job with a small engineering firm in town. It was only 20 minutes from her ranch. The pay was less than her city job, but her expenses were much lower now. She had no rent and she grew much of her own food. On weekends, Sarah would take long walks around her property. She learned about the different plants and trees. She watched the wildlife that lived on her land. There were deer, rabbits, and many different birds. Sometimes she would sit by the creek and just listen to the water flowing over the rocks. Sarah's city friends visited a few times in the first year. Most of them thought the ranch was too quiet and boring. They missed the restaurants and shops and nightlife of the city. But Sarah didn't miss any of that. She had found her peace. The first winter was challenging but rewarding. Sarah learned how to keep the chickens warm and the water pipes from freezing. She stocked up on firewood and enjoyed cozy evenings by the fireplace. The snow made everything look like a Christmas card. By the second year, Sarah had settled into a perfect routine. She knew every inch of her property. She knew which areas got the most sun for her garden. She knew where the best wildflowers grew in the spring. She knew exactly when the deer would come to drink from the creek. Sarah often thought about her old life in the city. It seemed like a different world now. She couldn't imagine going back to the noise and crowds and stress. Here on her ranch, she felt truly free. The mailbox had become like a symbol of her new life. Every day when she walked down the driveway to get her mail, she felt proud. The wooden box was weathering nicely. It looked like it had always been there. Sarah had no idea that her peaceful life was about to change. She had no way of knowing that her simple wooden mailbox would soon become the center of a battle. As she stood on her porch that morning, drinking her coffee and watching the sunrise, everything seemed perfect. The chickens were clucking softly in their coop. The garden was full of healthy plants. The old oak trees rustled gently in the morning breeze. Sarah took a deep breath of the clean country air and smiled. This was home. This was where she belonged. She finished her coffee and walked down to check on the chickens. They ran to greet her, hoping for some extra corn. Sarah laughed and scattered a handful of grain for them. Then she walked over to her garden to see how the tomatoes were doing. Everything was growing well. The plants were green and healthy. Soon she would have more vegetables than she could eat. She would share them with Frank and his wife, just like she did every summer. Sarah had no idea that in just a few weeks her quiet rural paradise would be invaded by people who thought they knew better than she did about how to live her life. The first sign of trouble came in Sarah's mailbox on a Tuesday morning in March. She walked down her gravel driveway like she did every day to get her mail. Along with the usual bills and catalogs, there was an official-looking envelope with a return address she didn't recognize. The letter was from the Millbrook Valley Homeowners Association. Sarah read it twice, then a third time. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Dear property owner," the letter began, "we are pleased to inform you that your property has been included in the expanded jurisdiction of the Millbrook Valley Homeowners Association. As a property owner in our community, you are now subject to our community standards and guidelines." Sarah sat down on her porch steps and kept reading. The letter went on to list dozens of rules and requirements. Property owners had to keep their grass cut to a certain height. Fences had to be approved by the association. All exterior paint colors had to be chosen from an approved list. But the part that made Sarah's stomach drop was near the end of the letter. All mailboxes must conform to approved designs and materials. Wooden mailboxes are not permitted due to safety concerns. You have 30 days to replace any non-conforming mailbox with an approved metal design. Sarah looked down her driveway at her beautiful wooden mailbox. She had built it herself with care and pride. It fit perfectly with the rural character of her property. Now some organization she had never heard of was telling her to tear it down. Sarah had never agreed to join any homeowners association. When she bought her property, there was no mention of an HOA in any of the paperwork. Her lawyer had been very careful to make sure there were no restrictions or covenants on the land. The letter included a phone number for questions. Sarah called immediately. A woman with a sharp voice answered. "Millbrook Valley HOA. This is Patricia, speaking. Hi, I received a letter today saying my property is now part of your association, but I never signed up for this. I don't understand how this is possible. Oh, you must be one of the new rural properties. Yes, we expanded our boundaries last month to include all properties within a 5-mile radius of the main subdivision. It's for the good of the whole community." Sarah felt her anger rising. "But I don't live in your subdivision. I live on a ranch outside of town. I specifically bought property that wasn't part of any HOA. I'm sorry, but the decision has been made by the County Planning Commission. All property owners in the expanded area are required to comply with our community standards. You should have received a copy of our guidelines with your letter." Sarah looked through the envelope again and found a thick booklet. She flipped through pages and pages of rules about everything from lawn care to holiday decorations. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said. "I live on a working ranch. Half of these rules don't even make sense for rural property. Ma'am, the rules apply to everyone equally. If you have specific concerns, you can attend our monthly board meeting and voice your opinions. But the requirements are non-negotiable." Sarah hung up the phone feeling frustrated and confused. How could they just decide she was part of their association? She hadn't voted on it or agreed to it in any way. Over the next few days, Sarah did some research. She learned that the county had indeed approved the HOA expansion. The Millbrook Valley subdivision had grown rapidly over the past few years. The developers wanted to control the area around their neighborhood to protect property values. Sarah called her lawyer, but the news wasn't good. The county had the legal right to create expanded HOA districts. Property owners could fight it in court, but it would be expensive and time-consuming. Most people just went along with the new rules. Sarah looked at the guidelines booklet more carefully. The rules seemed designed for suburban neighborhoods, not rural properties. Grass had to be kept under 3 inches tall. Sarah's property was mostly natural prairie grass and wildflowers. There were restrictions on outdoor storage that would make it illegal to keep her chicken feed and farm tools in her barn. The mailbox rule was just one of many problems. All mailboxes had to be black metal with white letters. They had to be mounted on specific types of posts. The design had to be approved before installation. Sarah's neighbor Frank stopped by later that week. He had gotten the same letter and was just as upset. "I've lived here for 40 years, Frank said. My mailbox has been in the same spot for 35 years. Now they want me to tear it down and put up some ugly metal thing." "Did you call them?" Sarah asked. "Oh, yes. They told me the old mailboxes are dangerous. Apparently wood can splinter if a car hits it, but I've never heard of anyone getting hurt by a wooden mailbox." Frank showed Sarah his copy of the guidelines. He had already marked several rules that would be impossible for him to follow. His property had an old barn that didn't meet the color requirements. His gravel driveway was too narrow according to the new standards. "Are you going to fight it?" Sarah asked. Frank shook his head sadly. "At my age, I don't have the energy for a big legal battle. My wife and I are thinking about selling and moving to a retirement community. We can't afford to bring everything up to their standards." Sarah felt sick. Frank and his wife were good neighbors and good people. The idea that they might be forced to sell their home because of arbitrary new rules made her angry. That evening, Sarah walked down to her mailbox again. She ran her hand over the smooth wood. She had sanded it carefully and applied 3 coats of paint. The letters were hand-painted with a small brush. It wasn't just a mailbox to her. It was a symbol of the independent life she had worked so hard to build. Sarah made a decision. She wasn't going to replace her mailbox. If the HOA wanted to force her to follow their rules, they would have to prove they had the right to do so. She would make them work for it. The next day, Sarah called a different lawyer who specialized in property rights. The consultation was expensive, but Sarah needed to know where she stood legally. The lawyer confirmed what she already suspected. The HOA expansion was legal, even if it seemed unfair. However, they couldn't just take action against property owners without following proper procedures. They had to give written warnings and opportunities to fix violations before imposing any penalties. "My advice is to comply with the reasonable requests and fight the unreasonable ones," the lawyer said. "Pick your battles carefully. Don't give them any excuse to come after you for obvious violations." But Sarah had already decided which battle she wanted to fight. Her mailbox was staying exactly where it was. 2 weeks later, Sarah received her first violation notice. Her mailbox was non-compliant with community standards. She had 10 days to replace it or face a fine. Sarah ignored the notice. She had paid for her property with her own money. She had built her mailbox with her own hands. No group of suburban developers was going to tell her how to live on her own land. But Sarah had no idea what she was up against. The Millbrook Valley HOA didn't just send letters and collect fines. They had recently hired their own security patrol to enforce their rules. And these community safety officers took their job very seriously. Sarah woke up on a Thursday morning and followed her usual routine. She fed the chickens, watered her garden, and made coffee. Then she walked down her gravel driveway to get the mail, just like she had done every day for 2 years. But when she got to the end of her driveway, Sarah stopped and stared. Her mailbox was gone, not just knocked over or damaged, completely destroyed. Pieces of splintered wood were scattered across the road and into the ditch. The metal numbers that spelled Martinez Ranch were bent and twisted in the gravel. Sarah's first thought was that a drunk driver had hit it during the night. These things happen sometimes on rural roads, but as she looked more closely, she noticed something strange. There were tire tracks in the soft dirt beside the road. The tracks showed that a vehicle had deliberately driven off the pavement. and directly over her mailbox. Sarah gathered up the broken pieces and carried them back to the house. Her beautiful wooden mailbox, which had taken her a whole weekend to build and paint, was now just a pile of splinters and bent metal. She called the sheriff's office to report the incident. Deputy Martinez, no relation, came out an hour later to look at the scene. "Looks like someone ran right over it," he said, examining the tire tracks. "Could have been kids joyriding, or maybe someone who was drinking. Hard to say. But look at these tracks," Sarah said, pointing to the marks in the dirt. "They show that whoever did this turned off the road on purpose. This wasn't an accident." The deputy shrugged. "Could be, but without any witnesses or other evidence, there's not much we can do. You can file a report for insurance purposes. Might want to think about putting your next mailbox further back from the road." After the deputy left, Sarah stood in her driveway and tried to make sense of what had happened. The HOA had been sending her violation notices about her wooden mailbox for weeks. Now suddenly the mailbox was destroyed. It seemed like too much of a coincidence. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. She drove to the hardware store and bought materials for a new mailbox. This time she decided to make it even sturdier. She used thicker wood and stronger metal brackets. If someone was going to try to destroy her mailbox, they would have to work harder to do it. Sarah spent the entire weekend building the new mailbox. She made it slightly larger than the first one and painted it the same white color with black letters. By Sunday evening, it was installed and looked even better than the original. On Monday morning, Sarah felt proud as she walked down to get her mail. The new mailbox was solid and beautiful. It looked like it belonged on her rural property. 3 days later, it was destroyed again. This time, Sarah was angry instead of confused. She had been expecting something like this to happen, so she was prepared. On Thursday evening, she set up a simple security camera pointed toward the road. It was just a basic trail camera that hunters used to watch for deer, but it would record anything that happened near her mailbox. Sarah built her third mailbox on the weekend. This one was even stronger than the second. She used pressure-treated lumber and heavy-duty metal hardware. She painted it carefully and installed it on Monday morning. Tuesday night, the camera captured everything. Sarah reviewed the footage Wednesday morning and couldn't believe what she saw. At 11:47 p.m., a white SUV with official-looking markings had driven slowly down Cedar Creek Road. The vehicle stopped near Sarah's driveway and she could see 2 people in the front seats looking at her mailbox. Then the SUV backed up about 50 feet. The driver gunned the engine and drove straight at the mailbox. The wooden post and box exploded into pieces as the vehicle struck it at full speed. The SUV didn't even slow down. It just kept driving down the road like nothing had happened. Sarah played the video over and over. The quality wasn't perfect because it was dark, but she could clearly see the official markings on the side of the SUV. It looked like some kind of security or patrol vehicle. Sarah called the sheriff's office again and asked for Deputy Martinez. She explained what had happened and told him about the video evidence. "Can you email me a copy of that video?" the deputy asked. "I'll take a look at it and see what we can determine." Sarah sent the video file and waited for a response. Later, that day, Deputy Martinez called her back. "I watched your video and you're right that it shows someone deliberately destroying your mailbox. The problem is the image quality. I can't make out any license plate numbers or identify the specific vehicle. Without that, it's still hard to prove who did it." "But you can see it's some kind of official vehicle," Sarah said. "Doesn't that narrow it down? Could be security company, could be maintenance crew, could be someone with a fake police car. There are a lot of possibilities. My advice is to keep recording and maybe you'll get better evidence next time." Sarah was frustrated, but not surprised. She was starting to realize that she was on her own in this fight. That afternoon, Sarah received another violation notice from the HOA. This one was different from the previous letters. It was much more threatening in tone. "Your property continues to be in violation of community mailbox standards," the letter said. "Repeated violations may result in increased fines and additional enforcement actions. The Millbrook Valley HOA takes community standards seriously and will use all available methods to ensure compliance. The letter was signed by Patricia Williams, the same woman Sarah had spoken to on the phone. But there was another signature at the bottom, someone named Dale Thompson, listed as Director of Community Safety. Sarah had never heard of Dale Thompson, or a Director of Community Safety. She wondered if this was connected to the official-looking vehicle in her security video. Sarah decided to do some research. She looked up the Millbrook Valley HOA online and found their website. There was a section about their community safety program that had been launched just 2 months earlier. According to the website, the HOA had hired Apex Security Solutions to provide professional community patrol services. The program included violation enforcement, suspicious activity monitoring, and emergency response coordination. Sarah found the Apex Security website and saw photos of their patrol vehicles. They were white SUVs with official-looking graphics and emergency lights. They looked exactly like the vehicle in her security video. Now Sarah understood what was happening. The HOA wasn't just sending letters and collecting fines anymore. They had hired their own private security force to physically enforce their rules. And these security officers thought they had the right to destroy property that didn't meet HOA standards. Sarah was outraged. Even if the HOA had the legal right to fine her for violations, they certainly didn't have the right to send people to destroy her property in the middle of the night. What they were doing was clearly criminal. But Sarah also realized she was in a difficult position. The security company was careful to operate at night when no one was around. They knew exactly when to strike and how to avoid getting caught. Her trail camera had captured the incident, but the video quality wasn't good enough to identify specific individuals or license plates. Sarah needed a better plan. She couldn't keep rebuilding her mailbox every few days just to have it destroyed again, and she couldn't count on the sheriff's office to help her without better evidence. That evening, Sarah sat on her porch and thought about her options. She could give up and install the metal mailbox the HOA wanted, but that would mean letting them win. It would mean accepting that they had the right to destroy her property and force her to follow their rules, or she could fight back. But if she was going to fight, she needed to be smart about it. She needed to gather evidence that would stand up in court, and she needed to find a way to catch these security officers in the act. Sarah looked down her driveway at the empty spot where her mailbox used to be. Tomorrow she would build another one, but this time she would be ready for whatever came next. Sarah decided she needed to document everything carefully if she was going to fight the HOA and their security patrol. She bought a notebook and started writing down every incident, every phone call, and every letter she received. She printed out copies of all her emails and kept them in a file folder. The fourth mailbox lasted 5 days before it was destroyed. This time, Sarah had improved her camera setup. She used 2 trail cameras positioned at different angles and added motion-activated lights. The footage was much clearer. The video showed the same white SUV with Apex security markings on the side. Sarah could see the license plate number clearly this time. She could also see 2 men in the front seats, though their faces weren't clear enough to identify. Sarah took the new video evidence to the sheriff's office and met with Deputy Martinez again. This time he seemed more interested. "This is definitely vandalism and destruction of property," he said after watching the video. "I can run this license plate and see who the vehicle is registered to. That should give us somewhere to start." The license plate came back registered to Apex Security Solutions. Deputy Martinez called the company and spoke to their manager. The manager claimed to know nothing about any mailbox destruction and said he would investigate internally. "He's probably lying," Deputy Martinez told Sarah. But without being able to identify the specific individuals in the video, it's hard to press charges. The company will just say it was unauthorized actions by rogue employees. Sarah was getting frustrated with the legal system, but she wasn't ready to give up. She decided to try a different approach. Instead of just dealing with the security company, she would go after the HOA directly. Sarah had been researching HOA law and learned that homeowners associations had to follow strict procedures when enforcing violations. They couldn't just skip steps or take matters into their own hands. Every violation had to be properly documented, and property owners had to be given opportunities to respond. Sarah requested copies of all the violation notices that had been filed against her property. She wanted to see if the HOA was following their own rules. What she discovered was shocking. According to the HOA's records, Sarah's property had been cited for dozens of violations she had never received notices for. The paperwork showed violation notices for tall grass, unauthorized storage, improper fence materials, and non-compliant exterior paint colors. Sarah had never received any of these notices. Her grass was natural prairie that didn't need cutting. Her storage was in an old barn that had been on the property for decades. Her fence was the original barbed wire that came with the ranch, and she had never painted anything except her mailbox. It seemed like the HOA was making up violations and backdating the paperwork to make it look like they had been following proper procedures. Sarah suspected they were doing this to justify the actions of their security patrol. Sarah decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. She wanted to confront them directly about what was happening to her property. The meeting was held in a conference room at a local hotel on a Tuesday evening. Sarah had never been to an HOA meeting before. She was surprised by how formal and bureaucratic it was. There were 5 board members sitting at a long table facing rows of chairs for property owners. Only about 20 people were in attendance. The board president was a stern-looking woman named Margaret Chen. She ran the meeting, like she was a judge in a courtroom. Property owners were only allowed to speak during a designated comment period, and they were limited to 3 minutes each. When Sarah's turn came, she stood up and introduced herself. Several board members exchanged glances when she said her name. They clearly knew who she was. "I'm here to complain about the destruction of my mailbox," Sarah said. "Someone has been deliberately driving over my mailbox in the middle of the night. I have video evidence that shows a security vehicle doing this." Margaret Chen looked at her notes. "Ms. Martinez, according to our records, your property has been in violation of community mailbox standards for several weeks. You have been notified multiple times about this violation." "I received notices about the mailbox," Sarah said, "but that doesn't give anyone the right to destroy my property. What's happening is vandalism and it's illegal." "I'm not aware of any destruction of property," Margaret said coldly. "Our community safety officers conduct regular patrols to monitor compliance with community standards. They don't engage in vandalism." Sarah felt her anger rising. "I have video evidence of your security patrol deliberately driving over my mailbox. Are you saying that's not destruction of property?" "I haven't seen any such video," Margaret replied, "and I would be very careful about making accusations without proof. The HOA takes defamation very seriously." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. They were denying something she had clear video evidence of. It was like they thought they could just lie and make the problem go away. "I'd be happy to show you the video right now," Sarah said. "I have it on my phone." "This is not the appropriate venue for reviewing alleged evidence," Margaret said. "If you have legitimate complaints about criminal activity, you should take them to law enforcement. This board meeting is for discussing HOA business." Sarah sat down feeling defeated. It was clear that the board was not going to help her. They were probably the ones who had ordered the security patrol to destroy her mailbox in the first place. After the meeting, Sarah was approached by an older man who had been sitting in the back row. He introduced himself as Robert Kim. "I heard what you said about your mailbox," Robert said. "The same thing happened to me last month. I had an old wooden mailbox that they said was a violation. I ignored their notices and someone destroyed it in the middle of the night." "Did you have any evidence?" Sarah asked. "No, I didn't think to set up cameras, but I knew it wasn't an accident. The way it was destroyed looked deliberate. I ended up just putting in one of their approved metal mailboxes because I didn't want to keep dealing with it." Robert told Sarah that several other property owners had experienced similar incidents. Anyone who refused to comply with HOA violations quickly found their property vandalized or damaged in mysterious ways. "They're basically running a protection racket," Robert said. "Follow our rules or bad things will happen to your property. But they're careful to do it in ways that are hard to prove." Sarah left the meeting feeling more determined than ever. Now she knew this wasn't just about her mailbox. The HOA was using intimidation and vandalism to force property owners to comply with their rules. It was organized and systematic. Over the next few days, Sarah contacted several other property owners who had been targeted by the HOA. She gathered stories and documentation from people who had experienced similar problems. The pattern was always the same. Ignore an HOA violation and your property would be mysteriously damaged. Sarah also filed a formal complaint with the County Planning Commission that had approved the HOA expansion. She argued that the HOA was exceeding their authority and engaging in criminal behavior. The Planning Commission said they would investigate, but Sarah wasn't optimistic about getting help from them. Meanwhile, Sarah built her 5th mailbox. This time, she made it extra strong and installed additional security cameras with better night vision. She also set up motion sensors that would send alerts to her phone if anyone approached her mailbox after dark. Sarah was tired of being on the defensive. It was time to start gathering the kind of evidence that would force law enforcement to take action. She had a plan, but it would require patience and careful preparation. The HOA security patrol had gotten away with vandalizing her property because they thought no one was watching, and no one would fight back. But Sarah was watching now, and she was definitely going to fight back. She just needed to catch them in the act in a way that left no doubt about what they were doing. Sarah's 5th mailbox was installed on a Friday. She didn't expect it to last long, but she was ready for whatever came next. This time, when they destroyed her mailbox, she would be ready with evidence that even the most skeptical sheriff's deputy couldn't ignore. Sarah had been thinking about the problem for weeks, and she finally had an idea. If the HOA security patrol wanted to destroy her mailbox, she would give them a mailbox they couldn't destroy. But it would look exactly like all the others they had already demolished. Sarah's background as a civil engineer was finally going to be useful for something other than designing bridges and buildings. She understood materials, stress loads, and structural integrity. If she was going to build a trap, she was going to build it right. The first step was research. Sarah spent hours online learning about different types of steel and concrete. She studied how to properly set posts in the ground and how to reinforce structures against impact. She looked up building codes and engineering standards for roadside installations. Sarah's plan was simple but effective. She would build what appeared to be another wooden mailbox, but it would be reinforced with steel in ways that wouldn't be visible from the road. When the security patrol tried to run it over, they would get a very unpleasant surprise. Sarah drove to a steel supply company in the next town over. She didn't want to buy materials locally where someone might recognize her and figure out what she was planning. She bought a thick steel pipe that would serve as the core of her mailbox post. She also bought steel plates that she could hide inside what would look like a wooden mailbox. The steel pipe was 6 inches in diameter and made of heavy-duty construction steel. It was the kind of material used for bridge supports and building foundations. Once it was set in concrete, it would be essentially immovable. Sarah also bought bags of concrete mix and rebar to reinforce the foundation. She calculated that she would need to dig a hole at least 4 feet deep and 2 feet wide to properly anchor the steel post. The whole installation would weigh over 1,000 pounds when it was finished. The trickiest part would be making the steel post look like wood. Sarah bought wooden boards that she could attach to the outside of the steel pipe. From the road, it would look exactly like her previous wooden mailboxes. Only someone who examined it closely would realize what was underneath. Sarah spent an entire weekend digging the hole for her new mailbox post. It was hard work, but she was motivated by months of frustration and anger. Every shovel full of dirt brought her closer to catching the vandals who had been terrorizing her. The hole was deeper than she had originally planned. Sarah wanted to make absolutely sure that her mailbox post would not move when someone hit it. She dug down 5 feet and made the hole 3 feet wide. This was going to be the most solid mailbox post in the county. Next came the concrete work. Sarah mixed the concrete in small batches because she didn't have professional equipment. She placed the rebar in the bottom of the hole first, then positioned the steel pipe in the center. She had to be very careful to make sure the pipe was perfectly vertical. Sarah poured the concrete slowly and carefully. She used a long rod to eliminate air bubbles and make sure the concrete filled all the spaces around the rebar and steel pipe. By the time she was finished, the foundation looked like something that could support a small building. While the concrete was curing, Sarah worked on the mailbox itself. She had bought a standard metal mailbox from the hardware store, but she reinforced it with steel plates welded to the inside. The whole assembly was then mounted to a steel bracket that would bolt directly to the top of the steel pipe. The wooden facade was the final touch. Sarah carefully measured and cut wooden boards to cover the steel pipe. She attached them with bolts that went through pre-drilled holes in the steel. From the outside, it looked exactly like a regular wooden post. Sarah even added fake wood grain and weathering to make it look old and rustic. She used the same white paint and black letters as her previous mailboxes. When she was finished, even she had trouble telling it was reinforced with steel. The final step was upgrading her security system. Sarah installed professional-grade security cameras with infrared night vision and motion detection. She positioned them to cover multiple angles and ensure that she would have clear footage of whatever happened. Sarah also installed floodlights that would automatically turn on when the motion sensors were triggered. She wanted to make sure she had perfect lighting for her cameras. There would be no excuse about poor video quality this time. To complete her security setup, Sarah installed a backup power system. She didn't want the cameras to fail if someone cut her power lines. The backup batteries would keep everything running for at least 12 hours. Sarah's new mailbox was installed on a Wednesday morning. It looked identical to all the previous ones from the road. The steel core was completely hidden by the wooden facade. Even the concrete foundation was covered by dirt and grass so it wouldn't be visible. But Sarah could feel the difference when she touched the post. It was solid as a rock. When she pushed on it with all her strength, it didn't move even slightly. This mailbox wasn't going anywhere. Sarah had also made some modifications to the mailbox itself. The steel reinforcement plates would ensure that it wouldn't crumple on impact. And she had added a small GPS tracker inside the mailbox in case someone tried to steal it instead of destroying it. The waiting was the hardest part. Sarah checked her cameras every few hours to make sure they were working properly. She tested the motion sensors and floodlights repeatedly. Everything had to be perfect when the moment came. Sarah also prepared for the aftermath. She had the phone number for Deputy Martinez programmed into her phone. She had copies of all her previous documentation ready to turn over to investigators. She had researched the laws about booby traps to make sure she wasn't doing anything illegal. According to her research, Sarah was legally allowed to protect her property as long as she wasn't creating hidden dangers for innocent people. Her reinforced mailbox would only be dangerous to someone who was deliberately trying to destroy it. A normal car accident would just result in a dented bumper. 3 days passed without incident. Sarah started to wonder if maybe the security patrol had given up or moved on to easier targets. Maybe they had realized she was recording them and decided it wasn't worth the risk. But on Saturday night, Sarah's patience was rewarded. Her phone buzzed with a motion detection alert at 11:34 p.m. Sarah grabbed her laptop and logged into her security system to watch the live feed. The familiar white SUV was approaching slowly down Cedar Creek Road. Sarah held her breath as she watched the two men inside examining her mailbox through their windshield. She could see them talking to each other, probably planning their attack. The SUV stopped about 50 feet past her driveway and began to back up. Sarah knew exactly what was coming next. She had seen this same routine in her previous videos. They were getting ready to ram her mailbox at full speed, but this time would be different. This time Sarah was ready for them. This time they were about to learn that actions have consequences. Sarah watched as the driver gunned the engine and accelerated toward her mailbox. The SUV was moving fast, probably 30 or 40 miles per hour when it struck the post. Sarah had calculated that this would be enough force to completely demolish any normal wooden mailbox. Instead, something very different happened. Something that would change everything. The impact was spectacular. Sarah watched through her security cameras as the white SUV struck her reinforced mailbox at full speed. Instead of the wooden post snapping and splintering like before, something completely different happened. Cat. SUV hit the immovable steel post like it had run into a concrete wall. The front end of the vehicle crumpled instantly. The hood buckled, and steam began pouring from the damaged radiator. Both airbags deployed with loud pops that Sarah could hear even from her house. The mailbox post didn't move an inch. The wooden facade was damaged where the SUV had hit it, revealing glimpses of the steel underneath. But the post itself stood exactly where Sarah had installed it, solid as a mountain. The SUV bounced backward from the impact and came to rest at an angle across the road. The engine was making terrible grinding noises before it finally died with a shudder. Fluid was leaking from underneath the vehicle and pooling on the asphalt. Sarah's floodlights had activated automatically, illuminating the scene like a stage. Her cameras were recording everything in perfect high-definition detail. This time there would be no questions about what had happened or who was responsible. The two men in the SUV sat stunned for several seconds. Sarah could see them moving around inside the vehicle, probably trying to figure out what had gone wrong. They had been destroying mailboxes for months without any problems. This was definitely not what they had expected. The passenger door opened first. A large man in a dark uniform climbed out slowly, holding his head. He looked dazed and confused. Sarah could see security printed on the back of his shirt as he walked around to examine the damage to the SUV. The driver took longer to get out. When he finally opened his door, Sarah could see that he was also wearing a security uniform. He was limping slightly as he walked to the front of the vehicle to look at the destroyed engine. Both men stood staring at Sarah's mailbox in disbelief. They clearly couldn't understand how a wooden post had done so much damage to their vehicle. The driver kicked at the post and immediately regretted it when his foot met solid steel. Sarah grabbed her phone and called 911. She had been waiting for this moment for weeks and she wanted everything done by the book. 911, what's your emergency? There's been a car accident on Cedar Creek Road, Sarah said. 2 men in a security vehicle crashed into my mailbox. They appear to be injured, and their vehicle is blocking the road. Sarah deliberately didn't mention that the crash was intentional. She would let the evidence speak for itself when the police arrived. Are the injuries serious? The dispatcher asked. I don't think so, but they're both walking around holding their heads. The vehicle is completely disabled, and there's fluid leaking everywhere. We'll have emergency services on the way. Please stay in a safe location until help arrives. Sarah watched through her cameras as the 2 security officers tried to figure out what to do. The driver was on his cell phone, probably calling his supervisor. The passenger was walking around the SUV taking pictures with his phone. After a few minutes, the driver approached Sarah's mailbox and began examining it more closely. He pulled away some of the damaged wooden facade and exposed the steel pipe underneath. Sarah could see his face change as he realized what had happened. The passenger came over to look as well. Both men were now staring at the reinforced post and having an animated discussion. Sarah wished she could hear what they were saying, but she could guess. They had just discovered that their victim had set a trap for them. The first emergency vehicle to arrive was a fire truck. 3 firefighters got out and began checking on the 2 security officers. From what Sarah could see, neither man was seriously injured, but they were both shaken up from the impact. Deputy Martinez arrived a few minutes later, followed by an ambulance. Sarah could see him talking to the security officers and examining the scene. She decided it was time to go down and give her statement. Sarah walked down her driveway carrying a laptop with all her security footage loaded and ready to show. She had printed copies of all her previous incident reports and violation notices from the HOA. Deputy Martinez, Sarah called out as she approached. I'm Sarah Martinez. This is my property. The deputy looked surprised to see her. Ms. Martinez, I understand these men crashed into your mailbox. Were you aware that anything had happened? Oh yes, Sarah said. I have security cameras that recorded the whole thing. Would you like to see the footage? Sarah opened her laptop and played the video for Deputy Martinez. The footage clearly showed the SUV backing up and then deliberately accelerating into the mailbox. There was no question that this was an intentional act, not an accident. This is the same vehicle that's been destroying my mailbox for the past 2 months, Sarah explained. I have video of 4 previous incidents. Tonight I was ready for them. Deputy Martinez watched the video several times, then looked at the damaged SUV and the intact mailbox post. So this post is reinforced with steel? Yes, Sarah said. I got tired of rebuilding my mailbox every few days. I decided to build one that couldn't be destroyed. The deputy walked over to examine the mailbox post. He could now see the steel pipe that was hidden under the wooden facade. This is like hitting a bridge support, he said. No wonder their vehicle is so damaged. One of the security officers overheard this conversation and walked over. "She set a trap for us," he said, angrily. "That's not a legal mailbox. It's a weapon disguised as a mailbox." "Actually," Deputy Martinez said, "it appears to be a mailbox that's built to withstand vandalism. What were you doing driving into it at high speed?" The security officer's face turned red. We were conducting a routine patrol and lost control of the vehicle." Sarah showed Deputy Martinez her security footage. "This video shows them backing up and deliberately ramming my mailbox. It's the same pattern they've used 4 times before." The deputy watched the video again and shook his head. "This is clearly intentional destruction of property. I'm going to need to place both of you under arrest." The 2 security officers protested loudly, but Deputy Martinez was firm. The video evidence was unmistakable. They had deliberately rammed the mailbox, and they had been caught red-handed. As the security officers were being handcuffed, one of them made a phone call. Sarah could hear him talking to someone about getting a lawyer and calling his supervisor. It sounded like this incident was going to cause problems for more people than just the 2 men in the SUV. A tow truck arrived to remove the damaged SUV. The vehicle was so badly damaged that it had to be winched onto the truck bed. Fluid from the destroyed engine had stained the road, and the fire department had to spread absorbent material to clean up the mess. Deputy Martinez took Sarah's full statement and collected copies of all her documentation. He seemed impressed by how thoroughly she had documented everything. "You've built a strong case," he told her. "These guys are going to have a hard time explaining away that video evidence. And this isn't just vandalism anymore. Ramming your mailbox with a vehicle could be considered assault with a deadly weapon." Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction as she watched the tow truck drive away with the destroyed SUV. After months of being victimized by the HOA's security patrol, she had finally turned the tables on them. But Sarah suspected this was just the beginning. The 2 security officers worked for a company, and that company had been hired by the HOA. Now that their illegal enforcement tactics had been exposed, there would probably be consequences for everyone involved. Sarah's mailbox was still standing exactly where she had installed it. The wooden facade was damaged, but the steel core was untouched. She would need to make some cosmetic repairs, but the structure was as solid as ever. As the emergency vehicles drove away and Cedar Creek Road returned to normal, Sarah walked back to her house with a smile on her face. She had won this battle, but she suspected the war with the HOA was far from over. Word traveled fast in a small community. By the next morning, news of the security patrol crash had spread throughout the area. Sarah's phone started ringing early with calls from neighbors who had heard about the incident. Robert Kim, the man she had met at the HOA meeting, called first. "I heard what happened last night," he said excitedly. "Is it true that you caught them red-handed?" "It's true," Sarah said. "I have everything on video. They drove straight into my mailbox just like they did to yours." "This is incredible," Robert said. "Do you know that at least 6 other people have had their property vandalized by these guys?" Everyone was too scared to speak up because they thought no one would believe them. Sarah spent the morning fielding similar calls from other property owners. It seemed like the HOA security patrol had been busy vandalizing properties all over the expanded district. People who had been afraid to complain were now coming forward with their stories. By noon, Sarah's story had reached the local newspaper. A reporter named Janet Walsh called and asked if she could interview Sarah about what had happened. "This sounds like a much bigger story than just one incident," Janet said. "If the HOA has been systematically vandalizing properties, the public needs to know about it." Sarah agreed to meet with the reporter that afternoon. She gathered all her documentation, including the security videos from multiple incidents and copies of all the threatening letters from the HOA. Janet Walsh was a veteran reporter who had covered local government corruption for years. She immediately understood the significance of what Sarah had uncovered. "This is organized criminal activity," Janet said after reviewing Sarah's evidence. "They've created their own private enforcement army to intimidate property owners into compliance. This goes way beyond what any HOA is legally allowed to do." The reporter spent 2 hours interviewing Sarah and reviewing all the documentation. She also called several other property owners who had been targeted by the security patrol. By the end of the day, Janet had enough material for a major investigative story. Meanwhile, Sarah received a visit from someone she wasn't expecting. Margaret Chen, the HOA board president, showed up at her door that evening looking very worried. "Ms. Martinez, I think we need to talk," Margaret said. "There's been a serious misunderstanding about what happened last night." Sarah invited Margaret inside, curious to hear what she had to say. Margaret seemed much less confident than she had at the board meeting. "The board was not aware that our security contractor was taking such aggressive enforcement actions," Margaret began. "We hired them to patrol the area and report violations, not to damage property." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You hired them to enforce your violations and you're surprised that they started destroying property? What did you think would happen?" "We thought they would just document violations and maybe issue warnings," Margaret said. "We never authorized them to take physical action against anyone's property." Sarah showed Margaret the video footage from the previous night's incident. Margaret watched in silence as the security SUV deliberately rammed Sarah's mailbox. "This is terrible," Margaret said when the video ended. "I had no idea they were doing things like this. The board is going to terminate their contract immediately." "It's a little late for that," Sarah said. "These men have been vandalizing property for months. You can't just fire them and pretend nothing happened." Margaret looked desperate. "What can we do to make this right? The board is willing to compensate you for your damaged mailboxes and any other losses you've suffered." Sarah realized that Margaret was probably more worried about lawsuits than she was about doing the right thing. The HOA was facing potential legal action from multiple property owners, not to mention possible criminal charges. "You need to take responsibility for what your security patrol has been doing," Sarah said. "And you need to make sure it never happens again to anyone else." Margaret nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. We're prepared to review all of our enforcement policies and make sure they comply with the law. We're also willing to settle any claims from affected property owners." After Margaret left, Sarah called Deputy Martinez to update him on the developments. The deputy told her that the two security officers had been formally charged with vandalism and assault. They were also facing additional charges for filing false police reports about their previous incidents. "The district attorney is very interested in this case," Deputy Martinez said. "If the HOA was directing these actions, they could be facing conspiracy charges as well." The next day, Janet Walsh's story appeared on the front page of the local newspaper. The headline read, "HOA Security Patrol Accused of Systematic Property Vandalism." The article detailed Sarah's experience and included interviews with several other victims. The story had immediate impact. Sarah's phone rang constantly with calls from other property owners who wanted to share their own stories of HOA intimidation. Many people had experienced problems but had been afraid to speak up alone. The County Planning Commission announced that they would be reviewing the HOA's expanded authority in light of the criminal allegations. Several county commissioners called for an investigation into how the expansion had been approved in the first place. Sarah also received a call from a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. He was interested in representing all the affected property owners in a class action lawsuit against both the HOA and the security company. "You've exposed a pattern of organized criminal activity," the lawyer told Sarah. "This isn't just about mailboxes. It's about an organization that thought it could use intimidation and vandalism to force people to comply with their rules." Millbrook Valley HOA called an emergency board meeting to deal with the crisis. Margaret Chen resigned as board president, and two other board members also stepped down. The remaining board members voted to immediately terminate their contract with Apex Security Solutions, but the damage was already done. The HOA faced lawsuits from at least a dozen property owners. Their insurance company was investigating whether the policy would cover intentional criminal acts, and the district attorney was considering filing criminal charges against the board members who had known about the security patrol's activities. Sarah found herself at the center of a much larger story than she had ever expected. What had started as a simple dispute over a mailbox had exposed systematic corruption and criminal activity. Media outlets from neighboring cities picked up the story, and Sarah received interview requests from television stations. The most satisfying moment came when Sarah received a formal apology letter from the HOA. They admitted that their enforcement practices had been inappropriate and illegal. They agreed to pay for all damage to her property and to stop citing her for mailbox violations. The letter also announced that the HOA was suspending all violation enforcement activities while they reviewed their policies and procedures. They were bringing in outside legal counsel to make sure their future actions would comply with state and local laws. Sarah's neighbor Frank stopped by to thank her for fighting back. "My wife and I decided not to sell our house after all," he said. "Knowing that the HOA can't keep bullying people makes us feel a lot better about staying." Other neighbors had similar reactions. The HOA's reign of terror was over, at least for now. Property owners could live peacefully without worrying about midnight visits from vandalistic security patrols. Sarah's reinforced mailbox had become something of a local landmark. People drove by just to see the mailbox that had brought down a corrupt HOA security operation. Sarah kept the damaged wooden facade as a reminder of what she had been through, but Sarah knew that the real victory wasn't just about her mailbox. It was about standing up to bullies and proving that ordinary people could fight back against organized intimidation. Sometimes all it took was one person who was willing to say enough and back it up with action. The legal proceedings would continue for months, but the immediate threat was over. Sarah could finally enjoy her rural paradise without worrying about what would happen to her property. And she had sent a clear message to anyone else who might think about using intimidation tactics. Some people don't back down, and some traps are worth setting. 6 months after the crash, Sarah stood on her porch and looked out at her property with satisfaction. The legal battles were finally coming to an end, and justice had been served in ways she never could have imagined. The criminal cases against the 2 security officers had concluded first. Both men pleaded guilty to multiple charges of vandalism, assault, and filing false police reports. They were sentenced to 6 months in jail and ordered to pay restitution to all the property owners they had targeted. More importantly, they were banned from working in any security capacity in the county. Apex Security Solutions faced much more serious consequences. The district attorney's investigation revealed that the company had been encouraging aggressive enforcement tactics to justify their high fees to the HOA. The company lost its license to operate in the state and was forced to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines and victim compensation. The owners of Apex Security also faced personal criminal charges. They were convicted of conspiracy and racketeering for running what the prosecutor called a criminal enterprise disguised as a security company. Both received prison sentences and were ordered to pay additional damages to their victims. But the biggest victory came with the HOA itself. The class action lawsuit filed by affected property owners had been devastating for the organization. The court found that the HOA board had knowingly hired a security company to intimidate property owners into compliance, making them liable for all the damage that resulted. The settlement was enormous. The HOA was forced to pay over $2 million in damages and legal fees. They also had to agree to strict oversight of their enforcement activities for the next 5 years. An independent monitor would review all violation notices and ensure that proper procedures were followed. Several board members faced personal lawsuits as well. Margaret Chen and 2 others were found to have acted outside their authority when they authorized the aggressive enforcement tactics. They were ordered to pay personal damages and were banned from serving on any HOA board in the future. The County Planning Commission had also taken action. They revoked the HOA's expanded authority over rural properties like Sarah's. The original subdivision remained under HOA control, but all the rural properties that had been forcibly included were released from the organization's jurisdiction. Sarah's property was officially free from HOA control for the first time since the expansion. She received a formal letter from the county stating that her property was no longer subject to any HOA rules or regulations. She could build whatever kind of mailbox she wanted, paint her house any color she chose, and live her life without interference from self-appointed community standards enforcers. The media attention had brought unexpected benefits as well. A television documentary crew had visited Sarah's ranch to film a segment about HOA abuse and property rights. The documentary won several awards and helped raise awareness about similar problems in other communities. Sarah had also been invited to speak at property rights conferences around the state. She shared her story with other property owners who were facing similar battles with overzealous HOAs and corrupt enforcement companies. Her advice was always the same: document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to fight back when you're in the right. The speaking engagements had led to consulting opportunities as well. Sarah now helped other property owners who were dealing with HOA disputes. Her engineering background and legal experience made her uniquely qualified to help people navigate complex property rights issues. Sarah's reinforced mailbox had become legendary in property rights circles. She received requests from people all over the country asking for the engineering specifications. Sarah was always careful to explain that her mailbox was designed for her specific situation and that people needed to check local laws before building anything similar. The mailbox itself still stood exactly where Sarah had installed it. She had repaired the wooden facade but left some of the damage visible as a reminder of what had happened. A small plaque next to the mailbox read, "In memory of property rights defended here, 2025. Frank and his wife had indeed decided to stay in their home. With the HOA no longer able to harass rural property owners, they felt comfortable aging in place. Frank often joked that Sarah's mailbox had saved his retirement. Other neighbors had similar stories. Robert Kim had planted a large garden that definitely violated the old HOA rules about appropriate landscaping. Another neighbor had painted his barn bright red in celebration of his freedom from community standards enforcement. The entire character of the area had changed. Property owners who had lived in fear of violation notices and midnight vandalism could now enjoy their land in peace. The rural community had returned to its roots as a place where people could live as they chose without interference from busybody neighbors. Sarah's own life had found a new balance as well. She still worked as an engineer, but her consulting and speaking work had given her additional income and flexibility. She had been able to expand her garden and add more chickens to her flock. The most satisfying change was the simplest one. Sarah could walk down to her mailbox every morning without worrying about whether it would still be there. The daily routine that had been disrupted for months was peaceful again. Sarah often thought about the lessons she had learned from the experience. The most important one was that standing up to bullies worked, but only if you were prepared to see it through to the end. The HOA and their security company had counted on people being too intimidated or too tired to fight back. When someone finally did fight back with documentation and determination, their whole corrupt system collapsed. Another lesson was the importance of community. Sarah had felt alone at the beginning of her fight, but she discovered that many other people were facing the same problems. Once they started working together and sharing their stories, they became much more powerful than any of them could have been alone. The legal system had worked, but only because Sarah had done her homework. The video evidence, careful documentation, and persistence had been essential. Without that preparation, the security officers might have gotten away with claiming the crash was an accident. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sit on her porch and reflect on how much had changed. Her simple desire to live peacefully on her own land had turned into a fight for property rights that affected hundreds of people. She hadn't asked to become a crusader, but she was proud of what she had accomplished. The sunset looked the same, as it always had over the hills behind her property. The chickens still clucked contentedly in their coop. The garden still produced fresh vegetables every summer. But now Sarah could enjoy all of it without looking over her shoulder or worrying about what the HOA might do next. Sarah's mailbox stood at the end of her driveway like a monument to the principle that some things are worth fighting for. It reminded everyone who passed by that ordinary people could stand up to organized intimidation and win. Sometimes all it took was the right person with the right plan at the right time. The battle was over, but the victory would last forever. Sarah had not only saved her own property rights but had helped protect the rights of everyone in her community. That was a legacy she could be proud of for the rest of her life.